Okay, let's unpack this. Try to picture this scene. New York City, sometime in the mid-19th century. Well, Wall Street.
Okay.
You're a bank porter, right?
Yeah.
Your job is navigating these chaotic streets, literally carrying bags filled with gold coins, specie they called it,
Yeah.
and bundles of paper checks. From your bank to another and another.
Wow. Just physically carrying them.
Physically carrying them. Because banks owe each other money constantly. And back then, settling up was a physical, messy, incredibly complex task.
It's hard to imagine today, isn't it? We think of money moving electronically, instantaneously. But the fundamental problem you're describing, how do institutions that exchange value actually, square their accounts at the end of the day? That was a massive logistical hurdle.
Exactly. And that seemingly archaic problem, this whole web of physical debts and obligations, is actually the perfect starting point for understanding the US dollar's journey. How it became the world's dominant currency, its immense power today, and the surprising challenges it faces in the future. This deep dive is all about that story, the story of King Dollar.
And for this deep dive, we've got a fantastic guide. Excerpts from Paul Blustein's book, King Dollar, The Past and Future of the World's Dominant Currency. We're working with material narrated by David Stifel. And Blustein takes us through the key history, the innovations, the crises, and the contemporary debates that have really shaped the dollar's reign.
So our mission today is to really go deep into the source material. We want to pull out the core insights, the critical moments, the author's perspective on what gives the dollar its strength, how that strength is used, and what could possibly challenge it.
Yeah.
We'll be looking at specific chapters, key dates, pivotal events, and even some direct quotes the author uses to bring this history to life for you.
It's a story that, it surprises you. Could that chaotic scene of porters on Wall Street from 1853 really hold clues to the U.S. government's geopolitical leverage today?
Seems unlikely, doesn't it?
It does. And what happens when the idea of money moves from physical bags and electronic wires to lines of code and entirely new digital forms? The source material suggests the answers involve trust, infrastructure, politics, and a lot of history.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So let's start at the beginning, right there on Wall Street, with those porters. And the problem they created that, it demanded an innovative solution.
Right. Let's unpack the situation described in Chapter 1. In the first half of the 19th century, banks in New York City constantly dealt with checks drawn on other banks.
Okay.
So if you, a customer, deposited a check you received from someone who banked at a different institution, your bank now had a claim on that other bank.
Right.
Someone, typically a bank porter, had to physically go to the other bank to collect the funds, often in gold coins, that specie.
And this wasn't happening just once or twice a day, I assume.
Oh no. Imagine dozens of banks, each receiving checks from customers who banked at all the other banks throughout the day. The porters were essentially running a citywide, decentralized exchange network by foot.
Sounds exhausting and error-prone and risky.
Definitely. The source quotes an account from 1858 describing the process on the steps of a Wall Street bank as filled with confusion, disputes, and unavoidable blunders. Just the sheer volume of checks and bags of coins being exchanged and recorded.
The author uses this fantastic, almost mind-bending example from that 1858 account to illustrate the complexity. It's about netting out these debts, right?
Yes, it's wild. Let me see if I can get this right. Thomas had left a bag of specie at John's bank, which was due from William's bank to Robert's, but Robert's bank owed twice as much to John's. What had become of that? Then Alexander owed Robert also, and William was indebted to Alexander.
Wow, my head is spinning already.
And it gets worse. It's this multi-layered cascade. Peter then said that he had paid Roberts by a draft from James, which James had received from Alfred on Alexander's account. That, however, had settled only half the debt. A quarter of the remainder was canceled by a bag of coin, which Samuel had handed over to Joseph, and he had transferred to David.
Oh, my brain ties itself in knots just trying to follow that.
Yeah.
The source quotes the account saying it was entirely safe to say that the presidents and cashiers of the banks themselves could not have untangled this medley.
Exactly. That level of complexity, that friction, must have been a huge drag on commerce.
You'd think so.
Precisely. It wasn't just inconvenient, it was a significant operational and financial risk. That's where the need for a more systematic approach became really clear. And it led to the innovation proposed by George Dummer Lyman.
Lyman was a bank clerk.
Right.
Right. So he saw this problem from the inside.
He did. In 1851, Lyman proposed a centralized process. He was inspired by the London Bankers' Clearinghouse, where English banks had clerks meet in a central location.
Okay.
But Lyman's improvement was the key. Instead of everyone settling with everyone, you bring all the checks to one place, figure out the net amount each bank owes or is owed by the system as a whole, and then only the net balances are transferred.
Okay. So clearing is figuring out the net obligations, and settlement is the final transfer of funds to square everything up.
Exactly right. This significantly reduced the number of physical transfers needed. His proposal led to the founding of the New York Clearinghouse. The source gives us the precise start date. Operations began on October 11th, 1853.
Right there on Wall Street.
Yep, just 2 years after Lyman proposed the idea.
And on that first day, the scale was already impressive. 52 banks exchanged checks worth $22.6 million. That clearly shows how desperate they were for a better way, doesn't it?
It really speaks volumes about the pent-up demand for this kind of efficiency. Now, this historical clearinghouse is the direct ancestor of the modern electronic systems we rely on today, particularly CUPS.
CUPS, the Clearinghouse Interbank Payment System. The author describes it in Chapter 1 as operating from a mid-Manhattan skyscraper, using sophisticated computers and algorithms. What kind of volume does it handle now?
An incredible amount. The source states it processes over 540,000 transactions every day, averaging about $1.8 trillion in value.
Trillion, wow.
Yeah, from porters carrying bags to trillions moving electronically, that's the scale of the transformation.
And the source emphasizes its reliability, which seems crucial.
Absolutely crucial. It's operated without incident, always settling payments, even during major crises like 9/11 or the 2008 financial crisis. That kind of robust, reliable infrastructure is just essential for a reserve currency.
Now, the book differentiates CHIPS from Fedwire. How do they compare? What's the difference?
Okay, so Fedwire is the public system owned by the Federal Reserve, and it primarily handles domestic transactions between U.S. banks. CHIPS is a private entity owned by a consortium of over 40 large banks.
Okay.
The key distinction the source highlights is that CHIPS handles over 90% of cross-border large-value dollar transactions.
Over 90%. So pretty much all the big international stuff.
Pretty much.
And SWIFT. We hear that name a lot in international finance contexts, especially with sanctions.
Yeah, that's a common point of confusion. The source clarifies that SWIFT is essentially a messaging system. It facilitates communication between banks globally, telling them about a transaction, but it doesn't actually move the money or settle the payment itself.
Okay. So it's like the email saying the money is coming, but CHIPS and Fedwire are the actual delivery trucks for dollars.
That's a pretty good analogy, yeah. They are the mechanisms for dollar clearing and settlement.
So this financial plumbing, as the author terms it, is located predominantly within the United States. Why is that such a big deal?
Well, this is where the historical development connects directly to modern power. The source explains that because CHIPS is located in a U.S. jurisdiction under U.S. law, it gives the U.S. government immense leverage.
How so?
Foreign banks, foreign governments, anyone wanting to transact in large volumes of dollars internationally essentially have to use a system located in the U.S. They need to take care lest they lose access, as the book puts it.
It becomes a control point, doesn't it? A choke point.
It absolutely does. Control over the primary infrastructure for global dollar flows is a significant source of geopolitical power. The author highlights this by quoting Brazil's President Lula in April 2023. He expressed this kind of bafflement, saying, "Every night I ask myself why all countries have to base their trade on the dollar. And part of the answer is that the main pipes for doing so are controlled by the U.S.
That's a powerful insight. From just a simple need for efficiency in settling checks, you get the foundation for global financial leverage.
Absolutely. And that system, built on trust and stability, has been tested by crises throughout history.
Let's turn to how crises have shaped the dollar's role, specifically touching on the idea of a lender of last resort. That seems to be covered significantly in Chapter 3.
Right. This part of the book opens with a really dramatic historical event that hammered home a crucial lesson. The panic in London following the failure of the Over & Gurney Company. This was on May 9th, 1866.
Okay.
The scene outside banks was apparently chaotic. Crowds clamoring to withdraw their deposits immediately after hearing Over & Gurney had failed. It was a classic run on the banks.
And this vulnerability stems from how banks operate, right? Fractional reserve banking.
Exactly. Banks don't keep all your deposited money sitting in a vault. They lend most of it out, keeping only a fraction on hand to meet daily withdrawals. The source makes this clear. It's not like a vault where all the money is physically present. It's out there, in loans, in houses.
like George Bailey explaining it in It's a Wonderful Life, the money's in Joe's house.
Precisely. So if everyone rushes to withdraw at once, even a fundamentally sound bank might not have the physical cash available at that moment.
Right. Liquidity versus solvency.
Exactly. And in the 1866 panic, fear spread rapidly. Solvent banks, those that were viable businesses but just temporarily illiquid, were caught up in the panic. The Bank of England, acting as the central bank, saw the need to provide cash, but was initially restricted by a law requiring gold backing for the banknotes it issued.
And this is where Governor Henry Holland and Deputy Thomas Hunt made a pivotal move.
Yes, on May 11th, just 2 days into the crisis, they sent an urgent letter to the Chancellor William Gladstone, the head of the Exchequer. Gladstone made the crucial decision to suspend the law requiring gold backing.
So they could print more money than they had gold for.
Essentially, yes. This allowed the Bank of England to issue an unlimited amount of banknotes, if needed, to meet the demand.
And this action quelled the panic.
The source says it did because it reassured the public and the banks. Suddenly, nobody had to worry about being last in the queue. Any bank that was fundamentally sound but needed cash could get it from the central bank. It stopped a liquidity crisis from turning into a solvency crisis for otherwise healthy institutions.
This historical episode directly led to the powerful doctrine articulated by Walter Bagehot, the famous editor of The Economist.
Right. Bagehot, in his famous treatise, analyzed this crisis and others. He argued that a central bank must act as a lender of last resort.
Meaning
It should lend freely, boldly, as he put it, to solvent institutions facing temporary illiquidity, provided they had good collateral. But importantly, he also stressed they should not crop up insolvent firms like Over and Gurney, which the Bank of England's own staffer accurately reported was rotten.
don't bail out the bad ones, but make sure the good ones don't fail, just because of panic.
That's the core idea. So the lesson from 1866 is fundamental. A central bank's ability to inject liquidity and act as a backstop is critical for financial stability.
Absolutely. And that principle is as relevant today as it was then, underpinning the stability of any major financial system, including the dollar system. We saw the Fed playing this global backstop role during the 2007-2009 financial crisis, didn't we?
We certainly did. Extending those dollar swap lines to foreign central banks was a modern application of that Bagehot principle on a global scale.
That role, that ability to provide liquidity globally, is part of what's been called the dollar's exorbitant privilege. This seems to be a key theme in chapters 4 and 6 of the book.
It is. The term exorbitant privilege, a great phrase, was coined by the French finance minister Valéry Giscard d'Estaing in the mid-1960s. It described the unique advantage the U.S. gained under the post-World War II Bretton Woods system.
That was the system that pegged currencies to the dollar, which was itself convertible to gold. And it faced the Triffin Dilemma.
Right. The Triffin Dilemma, named after the economist Robert Triffin, identified this core conflict. For global trade and economic growth to flourish after the war, the world needed more dollars. Lots more.
Okay.
But for the U.S. to supply those dollars, it had to run balance of payments deficits, basically spending more abroad than it earned. The paradox was that running these deficits to provide global liquidity would eventually undermine confidence in the dollar's ability to be converted into gold, as U.S. gold reserves couldn't keep pace with the sheer number of dollars being issued.
So you had to provide the world with dollars, but doing so risked the stability of the dollar itself. Catch-22.
Exactly. Giscard d'Estaing highlighted that the U.S. had the exorbitant privilege of being able to run deficits relatively freely because other countries needed and held dollars. They essentially financed U.S. spending by accumulating dollars. This kind of autonomy just wasn't available to other nations.
The book brings this concept forward to a more recent period, what it calls Bretton Woods II, particularly in the mid-2000s, covered in Chapter 6.
Yeah, this period illustrated a really complex codependency. You had the U.S. consuming heavily, running large trade deficits, the author calls it an import binge, while export-oriented economies, especially China, accumulated vast dollar reserves by effectively financing that deficit.
China maintained a fixed exchange rate against the dollar during this time, right? Like pegged it.
Yes, the source notes it was fixed at 8.28 renminbi per dollar pretty much since 1994, despite China running a massive current account surplus. Many, especially in U.S. manufacturing, saw this as currency manipulation, giving China an unfair trade advantage.
But pushing back was risky.
Very risky. Any aggressive U.S. action to force appreciation could have had significant economic fallout for both countries and the world.
And China's foreign currency reserves grew exponentially during this period.
They really did. The source points out that China's reserves swelled to $1.7 trillion by 2007. That was quintupling in just 5 years. This accumulation was a direct result of their export success, and that fixed exchange rate policy, they were basically soaking up incoming dollars to prevent the renminbi from appreciating.
This Bretton Woods II system, like the original Bretton Woods, raised sustainability concerns, didn't it?
Absolutely. Critics worried it was a fragile system, just waiting to collapse. The source quotes Kenneth Rogoff, who was the IMF chief economist then, warning back in November 2004 that the world is set to jump off the top of a waterfall because of these huge imbalances.
Strong words.
Yeah, and another economist, William Klein, stated in November 2005, sooner or later the rest of the world will decide that the United States is no longer a safe bet.
So, this exorbitant privilege, while powerful, was also seen as building up significant risks in the global system. Yet, despite these predictions of imminent collapse, the dollar has repeatedly defied forecasts of its demise.
This resilience is a major theme in the book, particularly highlighted in Chapter 3, which the author jokingly calls the Mark Twain chapter. Because, like Twain's famous line, reports of my death have been greatly exaggerated.
Right, yeah. It feels like the dollar's funeral has been announced multiple times over the decades.
Constantly. The source mentions predictions of doom during periods of high U.S. inflation in the 1970s, and then again later due to persistent trade and budget deficits. But the dollar system, for all its perceived flaws and imbalances, has proved incredibly durable.
The global financial crisis of 2007-2009 is a prime example, right? I mean, a crisis originating in the U.S. housing market, yet demand for dollars soared.
It's a really counterintuitive moment, isn't it? The source notes there was frenetic demand for dollars all over the world during the peak of the crisis. In moments of global panic, the flight to safety overwhelmingly favored the dollar and U.S. Treasury assets.
And the Fed stepped in globally.
Massively. The Fed acted as that global backstop, providing dollar liquidity through those swap lines to dozens of central banks around the world, preventing a global dollar shortage from making the crisis even worse.
This ability to act decisively is often linked to the strength and independence of the Federal Reserve, particularly highlighted by actions like those of Paul Volcker.
Volcker's tenure as Fed chair, starting in July 1979, is covered in Chapter 5 as a really pivotal moment for reestablishing the dollar's credibility. He was appointed by President Carter specifically to tackle the rampant inflation of the time, signaling a serious commitment to price stability.
He took a very aggressive, hawkish approach, as they say.
He certainly did. The source details his key policy shift. Instead of targeting interest rates directly, which had been the practice, the Fed under Volcker targeted the growth rate of the money supply, specifically M1.
And the effect?
Well, it resulted in dramatically higher interest rates initially, which caused significant economic pain, a deep recession, actually. But it eventually broke the back of inflation expectations. The source notes this ultimately led to lower unemployment, quiescent inflation, lower interest rates later in the 1980s.
Creating the backdrop for Reagan's Morning in America.
Exactly. It provided the economic stability for that narrative.
So demonstrating the political will and, crucially, the central bank independence to prioritize price stability, even at the cost of short-term pain, was absolutely crucial for maintaining trust in the dollar's value.
Absolutely. That institutional strength, that credibility, is a key reason why the dollar has weathered storms that many predicted would sink it.
Now let's shift gears a bit and discuss one of the most contentious aspects of the dollar's power, its use as a sanctions tool. The source goes into this in quite some detail across several chapters, 5, 6, 9, 10, 12, 17, 18.
Right. This is where the control over that international dollar plumbing, GHPS, becomes a direct instrument of foreign policy. The U.S. government has increasingly employed financial sanctions as a primary tool against adversaries, leveraging the dollar's central role in the global system.
The author uses a pretty vivid analogy to describe how this power was developed, doesn't he?
He does. Chapter 9 uses the analogy of youngsters experimenting with a chemistry set and exulting over the explosions they could ignite. It reflects how U.S. officials, particularly in the Treasury and Justice Departments, sort of discovered and then refined the legal and technical means to exert control over global dollar flows. This was aided by congressional legislation and the involvement of U.S. prosecutors pursuing violations of sanctions.
How does it actually work in practice? It's more than just telling U.S. companies not to deal with someone, right?
Yeah.
It feels more pervasive.
Oh, much more. The source emphasizes that GHPS is the critical choke point, handling the vast majority of cross-border dollar payments. The U.S. government has legal jurisdiction over the system itself and over the large banks that operate on it.
Even foreign banks.
Yes, even foreign banks that want to process dollar transactions globally typically need a U.S. banking license, or at least a correspondent banking relationship with a U.S. bank. That brings them under U.S. legal purview and subjects them to U.S. regulations and, crucially, potential sanctions.
So even if a payment starts in, say, Germany and ends in Japan, if it's in dollars and passes through the U.S. system via CATATs, it's technically subject to U.S. rules.
Precisely. The source cites an astonishing statistic from the book, The Payoff. Almost every cross-border payment, regardless of the currency actually, touches one of just 15 major global banks at some point. And all of those banks are deeply intertwined with the U.S. financial system. This concentration makes enforcing sanctions far more effective than you might think.
And the legal basis for this power. What allows the U.S. government to do this?
A key statute is the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEEPA, from 1977. The source, quoting a legal expert named Smith, notes that the president can trigger IEPA's really broad authorities, including asset freezing, by simply declaring a national emergency.
And national emergency can mean a lot of things.
The legal interpretation of what constitutes a national emergency is described as uniquely broad, granting significant power to the executive branch in this area.
This sanctions power was significantly expanded after 9/11 and linked to anti-money laundering efforts, wasn't it?
Yes. Chapter 10 covers this connection. The crackdown on illicit finance led to the creation of FinCEN, the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, strengthening the Bank Secrecy Act, which actually dates back to 1970, making money laundering a specific federal crime in 1986. The U.S. was the first country to do that. And the establishment of international bodies like FATF, the Financial Action Task Force, in 1989.
FATF sets the global standards.
Right. They set global anti-money laundering, AML, know your customer, KYC, and countering the financing of terrorism, CFT standards that countries are pressured to adopt.
And OFAC's role in this, the Treasury Department Office.
OFAC, the Office of Foreign Assets Controls, is the enforcement arm within Treasury. It maintains the Specially Designated Nationals List, the SDN list. This list used to be grimly called Law List of Clinton after its prominent use against Colombian cartels in the 1990s.
So getting put on the SDN list is bad news.
Extremely bad news. Designating an entity like Bank Melli Iran, a major Iranian bank, in 2007 to 2008 effectively cuts them off from the U.S. financial system. But it also pressures other institutions worldwide to avoid dealing with them under threat of secondary sanctions. The OFAC 50% rule, for instance, can sanction entities owned 50% or more by an SDN.
They even use SWIFT data to track terrorist financing, the source says.
They did. Through the Terrorist Finance Tracking Program post 9/11, it demonstrates the many ways U.S. authorities can leverage information and control points within the global financial system.
So the dollar weapon is undeniably potent, but the source also details significant downsides and limitations to its use, right? The blowback, as they call it.
Absolutely. Overuse or poorly targeted sanctions can have really negative consequences. The source details the 2018 Rusal sanctions against the Russian oligarch Oleg Deripaska and his aluminum company Rusal. That's covered in Chapter 12.
What happened there?
Designating Rusal as an SDN caused global aluminum prices to spike by something like 20% almost overnight. This hurt industries worldwide, including key U.S. allies and even Rusal's own operations in places like Ireland, causing job concerns there.
And the U.S. was forced to backtrack on that one.
Yes. After significant pressure from allies and industry groups, the U.S. Treasury had to execute what the source calls an embarrassing retreat, easing the sanctions after Deripaska agreed to reduce his ownership stake. It really illustrated the risk of collateral damage and the political cost when sanctions disrupt global markets too much.
There's also the risk that countries targeted, or even just those watching, will try to reduce their dependence on the dollar, right, to avoid being vulnerable.
This is a major concern highlighted repeatedly by the author. The source quotes former Treasury Secretary Jacob Lew warning about this back in 2016 and again in 2018. He worried that excessive use of sanctions could encourage countries to find or build alternatives to the dollar system. Secretary of State John Kerry voiced similar concerns around that time too.
And we've heard leaders like Brazil's President Lula and Kenya's President Ruto questioning this reliance more recently.
Exactly. Lula's comment in April 2023 about wondering why trade needs the dollar, and Ruto's question in June 2023, how is U.S. dollars part of the trade between Djibouti and Kenya? Why? They reflect this growing pushback.
Is de-dollarization really happening, though?
Well, the source suggests that while de-dollarization is often talked about, actually replacing the dollar is incredibly difficult due to network effects, lack of credible alternatives, etc. But these comments definitely show the desire to reduce vulnerability to U.S. financial pressure.
The sanctions against Russia after its 2022 invasion of Ukraine are the most recent high-profile use of this tool. Chapters 10, 17, and 18 discuss this.
Yes, freezing Russia's central bank reserves, over $640 billion held abroad, was a huge, unprecedented move for an economy of Russia's size and integration. The source notes that while it was impactful, some initially felt simply removing certain banks from SWIFT wasn't enough, underscoring the ongoing debate about how hard to hit them.
And there's the debate about confiscating those frozen reserves for Ukraine.
That's a really live and contentious issue, yes. Discussed in Chapter 17.
The U.S. has been increasing the pressure more recently, too.
Yes. The source mentions the mid-June 2024 expansion of secondary sanctions by the Biden administration. This specifically targets foreign banks in places like China, Turkey, the UAE, that are dealing with sanctioned Russian entities, even for non-dollar transactions sometimes. It puts significant pressure on those banks to choose between accessing the dollar system and continuing business with Russia. A significant screw tightening, as the source puts it.
But the author suggests the U.S. hasn't gone all in, implying there's a limit to how far they dare push, perhaps.
That's the nuance that comes through in Chapter 17. The source notes there are still exemptions, particularly for oil and agricultural trade, reflecting the U.S. administration's deep concern about the impact on global energy and food prices, and therefore inflation back home and in allied countries. Treasury officials reportedly pushed for tougher measures, like against Russia's shadow fleet carrying oil, but were overruled by the White House.
So it's calculated.
Right. The author describes this as circumspect use, not impotence. It indicates the U.S. likely has more power it could deploy, but is wary of the unpredictable blowback and economic consequences.
And Russia's economy hasn't collapsed, despite the unprecedented pressure.
This provided a humbling lesson, according to the source in Chapter 17. The bigger the target, the harder it is to make it fall. Sanctioning a major global energy producer and commodity exporter presents entirely different challenges than sanctioning smaller economies or individuals.
There's also the risk that targets might retaliate in kind, isn't there?
Chapter 18 explores this risk explicitly, using a hypothetical scenario of a Chinese invasion of Taiwan. The source suggests China might retaliate against U.S. economic sanctions by hitting U.S. companies reliant on Chinese manufacturing or markets. Think Apple, Dell, HP. The message could be, as the author puts it starkly, you want a new iPhone. Guess what?
Wow. That's a stark reminder of global economic interdependence. The sanctions weapon can cut both ways.
It certainly can. The source also points out the more subtle problem of overcompliance also in Chapter 18.
What's that?
It's where banks become so fearful of violating complex sanctions rules and facing huge fines that they refuse to process even legitimate licensed transactions. The example given is a case where crucial medicine for liver transplants couldn't be shipped to Iran despite having explicit OFAC licenses because banks just didn't want to take any risk.
That's a real human cost of the system's complexity and the bank's understandable caution.
It is. And finally, the source pushes back against the idea that another currency, particularly the Chinese renminbi, would necessarily be used more benevolently if it somehow became the dominant one. Chapter 18 recounts China's own history of economic coercion, blocking Norwegian salmon imports in 2010 after the Nobel Peace Prize decision, forcing South Korean lot stores to close in 2017 over a missile defense system, restricting various Australian imports in 2020 during a diplomatic spat.
Those examples suggest that shifting dominance to the renminbi wouldn't automatically mean a fairer or less politically motivated global financial system.
Exactly. So while the dollar weapon is powerful, its use has clear limitations, it generates significant blowback, and it fuels a desire for alternatives. Right. However, the source remains pretty skeptical that these alternatives are currently capable of displacing the dollar entirely.
That leads us perfectly into our next major section, the digital frontier. The source dedicates considerable space to this, covering chapters 13, 14, 15, 18, and 19. This is where money itself is being fundamentally transformed by technology.
Right. The book frames this as a truly revolutionary transformation. It traces the history of payments tech, reminding us that money has always evolved. from, ancient Lydian coins around 600 BC to paper money in Song Dynasty China between AD 960 to 1279, the double-entry ledger systems of Italian city-states, the telegraph facilitating faster transfers via Western Union in 1871, then electronics, magnetic stripes in the late 1970s, and of course the internet enabling companies like Amazon and PayPal.
These were innovations in making payments faster, easier, more efficient, basically.
Right. But the source makes a key point. Even modern digital payments are still largely linked to traditional financial institutions. They require identity verification, they rely on existing legal frameworks, and fundamentally, they rest on trust in those intermediaries, the banks, the payment processors.
And this is where the cypherpunks and the idea of crypto come in, the desire to bypass those trusted intermediaries entirely.
Exactly. That desire for disintermediation, for removing the middleman, was a driving force behind the Bitcoin white paper. It was published pseudonymously by Satoshi Nakamoto at the end of October 2008, right in the middle of the financial crisis.
Timing.
Interesting timing, yeah. The source quotes Satoshi directly on the root problem with conventional currency, which he or she or they saw as the trust that's required in central banks and the history of breaches of that trust.
So Bitcoin and crypto were born from a fundamental distrust of centralized financial authorities.
That's the core philosophical idea. However, the source points out that despite the grand visions, crypto's real-world use cases have remained pretty limited. Often confined to illicit transactions, the Silk Road Marketplace is the classic example, or just pure speculation, the greater fool's theory, where you hope to sell it to someone else at a higher price.
And exchanges like Coinbase seem to reintroduce intermediaries anyway.
Right. Which kind of contradicts the original decentralized ideal, the source notes. But there was a moment that really jolted economic officials from indifference about crypto and its potential.
Which was?
That was Facebook's unexpected announcement of Libra in mid-June 2019. Its sheer scale and ambition aiming to empower billions globally with a permissionless, blockchain-based stablecoin backed by a basket of major currencies, it caught regulators and central bankers completely off guard.
And Facebook's reputation didn't help.
Not at all. The immediate awareness of Facebook's past data privacy scandals just added to the global alarm.
The project tried to adapt, right? Became Deem.
It did. It was rebranded Deem, and they brought in a former senior Treasury official, Stuart Levy, to lead it, adding stricter know your customer rules and trying to appease regulators. But despite these efforts, it never got the crucial green light.
Why not?
The source highlights a breakfast meeting on June 24, 2021, between Fed Chair Jerome Powell and Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen as effectively the project's death knell. Yellen, in particular, had deep-seated concerns about its potential financial stability implications and the risk it could undermine sovereign currency and monetary policy.
So even a massive global corporation couldn't just launch its own parallel currency system without sovereign approval.
Not when it aimed to operate at that scale and potentially bypass existing regulated systems. Meanwhile, other forms of digital innovation, ones that work closer to the existing financial infrastructure, have seen rapid success.
Like the fast payment systems we see in countries like India and Brazil.
Exactly. India's UPI, launched back in 2016, provides simple, free account-to-account transfers via mobile phones, and it's ubiquitous there now. Brazil's Pix, launched in November 2020, signed up something like 2/3 of Brazilian adults within a year, and quickly became the dominant payment method.
So these are examples of incredibly successful digital payment innovations, but they operate within the established banking system using central bank infrastructure.
Correct. They improve the existing system rather than trying to replace it wholesale. The source also touches on the more abstract idea of an internet of value and the potential for technology to unbundle money's traditional functions.
Okay, what does that mean?
The internet of value concept envisions technology allowing value money, assets, property rights to be transferred as easily as information moves on the internet today, potentially reducing the need for traditional intermediaries. Unbundling refers to the idea that the best asset for spending, means of exchange, for accounting, unit of account, and for saving, store of value, might not necessarily be the same single currency in the future. Technology could make switching between different assets for different purposes seamless and cheap. Yeah, and the source even explores possibilities like programmable money payments, automatically triggered by specific events, verifiable by data. Imagine health insurance paying out automatically when certain diagnostic data is recorded, or crop insurance paying out based on satellite rainfall data, all without manual claims processing.
Okay, that sets the stage for the really heated debate around central bank digital currencies, or CBDCs. This is covered in chapters 13, 14, 15, and 18.
Yeah, this is a highly divisive topic globally, and especially within the U.S. In the U.S., a common argument among advocates for a CBDC is the fear that if the U.S. doesn't issue one, China's digital yuan, the ECNY, will gain international dominance.
Fear of being left behind by China.
Exactly. And the concern that China could use it to spread Beijing's influence or even gather data through transactions. But critics raise significant concerns, seeing a CBDC as a potential tool for government repression.
The Big Brother scenario.
Right. They worry about the government being able to track every single transaction, freeze the funds of disfavored groups or individuals, or even program the money to control behavior like, you can only spend this money on certain things, or it expires after a certain date.
The author seems somewhat skeptical of the most extreme dystopian fears, referencing the Bahamian sand dollar experience.
Yes, in Chapter 13, the author notes that the sand dollar, the Bahamian CBDC, which was issued years before his visit, had seen very limited adoption. People just weren't using it much. He offers a paraphrase of that old saying, suppose they gave a CBDC and nobody came, suggesting that even if a CBDC were issued, adoption isn't guaranteed if people don't see the need or don't trust it.
The Bank for International Settlements, the BIS, seems to have become a major proponent for CBDCs, despite some initial reservations, according to the source.
They have. It's quite a shift. The source mentions that in March 2019, the BIS general manager, Augustin Carstens, was quoted calling CBDCs neither necessary nor desirable. But that stance has changed dramatically. Chapter 13 highlights Carstens now arguing that the crucial part is the CB central bank, emphasizing that a CBDC would allow ordinary citizens direct access to central bank money, which is considered the safest form of money, a privilege currently reserved only for commercial banks.
What about China's ECNY itself? Chapter 14 gives the book's perspective on that.
The source suggests the primary drivers for the ECNY were actually domestic things like increasing state control over payments, displacing private payment providers like Alipay and WeChat Pay, and improving payment efficiency within China, rather than a strategic push for global dominance. This view is supported by experts like Martin Torzempa, cited in the book.
But the privacy concerns are real.
Oh, absolutely. While Beijing promises controllable anonymity, the source doesn't shy away from acknowledging the significant privacy and civil liberties risks, especially given China's existing pervasive surveillance state. The potential for misuse is obvious.
So the bigger international worry about the ECNY might be its adoption by other authoritarian regimes who see it as a model.
That seems to be the key concern raised in the source. It also reiterates why the ECNY is unlikely to significantly challenge the dollar internationally anytime soon, primarily because it doesn't address the fundamental reasons for the renminbi's limited global use. Things like China's weak rule of law, its capital controls, and the lack of deep, trusted financial markets.
It's not like cash you can easily use anywhere.
Exactly. It's not easily usable in offshore markets or for anonymous black market transactions like physical cash can be. Other central banks would almost certainly demand multilateral agreements and transparency before allowing widespread ECNY usage in their jurisdictions.
The BIS's vision, particularly detailed in their June 2022 report, The Future Monetary System, seems to provide a more sophisticated rationale for digital money innovation than just competing with China. Chapter 15 covers this.
Yes, the BIS argues there's a vast gulf between the crypto vision and its reality, pointing to the failures, hacks, and instability in the crypto market in the early 2020s. The source quotes Hyun-Song Shin, a key BIS economic advisor, with his pithy motto, "Anything crypto can do, CBDC can do better." Except, Shin sardonically adds money laundering and ransomware attacks. He acknowledges crypto showed the potential of features like programmability, but argues CBDCs or CBDC-linked systems can offer these on a much more secure and stable foundation anchored by the central bank.
They seem particularly interested in tokenized deposits as a path forward.
This is presented in Chapter 15 as a potentially promising direction, especially for the U.S. Tokenized deposits would essentially be digital tokens representing commercial bank deposits. The key advantage from the BIS perspective is they preserve the singleness of money, that fundamental concept that a dollar is a dollar, whether it's cash, a regular bank deposit, or a digital token. It avoids fragmentation.
How would that differ from just having a digital bank account now? What's the token part to?
The BIS vision suggests this could potentially involve a wholesale CBDC used only by banks for settlement behind the scenes, not a retail CBDC for the public. Tokenized deposits would still sit at commercial banks, maintaining existing protections like deposit insurance. But the tokenization could enable more sophisticated programmability for things like complex supply chain payments or instant settlement of property transfers, all settling efficiently on the central bank's ledger.
So it feels like a middle ground, trying to get the benefits of digital programmability without the risks of fully decentralized crypto, or maybe some of the privacy concerns of a full retail CBDC.
That seems to be the idea, yes. Marrying innovation with the trust and stability of the existing two-tiered banking system. And speaking of privacy, the source tackles that difficult trade-off, highlighted by Fed Governor Randall Quarles in his memorable parachute pants speech mentioned in Chapter 14.
Right, the balancing act between privacy and preventing illicit activity.
Exactly. Designing a CBDC forces a stark choice. Do you create a system with detailed transaction records easily accessible to authorities, which minimizes crime but raises massive surveillance fears? Or do you build in strong anonymity features, which protects privacy but risks enabling money laundering, terrorist financing, and other illicit uses?
Tough call.
Very tough. The source mentions the Bahamian Sand Dollars tiered system as one attempt to balance this, allowing full anonymity for small transactions up to a certain threshold, but requiring identification for larger amounts.
And the totalitarianism concerns the fear that a CBDC could be used to freeze funds or control behavior, like what happened with the Freedom Convoy assets in Canada without a CBDC.
The source addresses this directly in Chapter 14. The argument made is that the real protection against government overreach isn't the specific form of currency itself, but the country's underlying respect for individual rights, due process, and the rule of law.
So if a government wants to be oppressive, it will find a way.
Pretty much. Freezing assets happened in Canada without a CBDC, using emergency powers directed at traditional bank accounts. The argument is that if a country has strong legal protections, like Fourth Amendment-type rules against unreasonable search and seizure in the U.S. context, those protections should ideally apply to a CBDC just as they apply to bank accounts. If a government doesn't respect those rights, the currency form is secondary.
Okay, so CBDCs are complex, heavily debated, with potential benefits in innovation and stability, but also significant risks related to privacy and government control. What about stablecoins? They're already a reality and growing. Chapters 14, 15, and 19 touch on these.
Right. Stablecoins like Tether, USDT, Circle USDC, or PayPal's PYUSD are digital tokens designed to maintain a stable value, typically pegged 1.1 to a fiat currency like the dollar. The source notes their significant use within the crypto world, often as casino chips for speculation, but also their ambition to become a widespread payment method. They've grown incredibly rapidly, quadrupling to over $175 billion in circulation by 2021.
Their main advantage in the U.S. political debate seems to be that they already exist and have scale.
That's certainly part of it, and their issuers have become very powerful lobbyists. However, the source, citing a Moody's report from late 2023, highlights a major drawback. Stablecoins frequently experience depegging events, where their value strays more than 3% from their target, usually $1.
How often?
This happened over 700 times in 2022 and over 600 times in 2023, according to that report. This suggests they lack that fundamental singleness of money reliability that you get with sovereign currency. They don't always hold their value perfectly.
And the crypto industry, including stablecoin issuers, has become a major political force in the U.S. Chapter 19 details the scale of this, right?
Yes, the source points to their massive spending and lobbying efforts. Crypto Political Action Committees, or PACs, had reportedly raised $194 million by the fall of 2024. That's more than any other single industry group. Fairshake was mentioned as a leading spender.
And they use that money strategically.
Very strategically. They've actively targeted politicians perceived as anti-crypto, like contributing to Representative Katie Porter's primary defeat in California, and supporting pro-crypto candidates across the political spectrum, regardless of party. Senator Sherrod Brown, chair of the Banking Committee, was facing heavy spending against him. Democrats were noted as scrambling to adjust.
And this has clearly influenced mainstream political figures, notably Donald Trump.
That's a key development highlighted in Chapter 19. Donald Trump's appearance at the Bitcoin 2024 conference in Nashville on July 27, 2024, was a really significant moment. The source contrasts his previous negative comments about crypto, calling it not money, based on thin air, with his completely new pro-crypto pitch there. He aimed to make the U.S. the crypto capital and a Bitcoin superpower.
Specific plans if elected.
Yes, his proposals included amassing a strategic national Bitcoin stockpile from Bitcoin seized from criminals, initially valued around $14 billion, easing regulations for crypto mining operations, and promising to fire SEC Chair Gary Gensler, who is widely disliked by the crypto industry for his enforcement actions.
Was this seen as a genuine shift in his views or something else?
The source suggests it was largely viewed as pandering, driven significantly by large campaign contributions from crypto industry figures and their growing political leverage. His VP pick, J.D. Vance, is also a known Bitcoin holder and supports eased regulations, influenced by figures like his mentor Peter Thiel, who holds strong libertarian, anti-central bank views. Thiel's quoted as saying, "Central banks are bankrupt."
And there's a potential personal financial angle mentioned in the book as well.
Yes, Chapter 19 points out his family's involvement in a venture called World Liberty Financial, or WLF. It promotes digital assets for lending and borrowing, and Trump himself has apparently promoted it on live streams, saying something like, "Crypto is one of those things we have to do."
Raising conflict of interest concerns.
Yes, the source notes this raises concerns about a blatant conflict of interest, alongside potential risks to American savings if they invest in speculative ventures, threats to broader financial stability from unregulated crypto activities, contagion risk, and the questionable use of taxpayer money to prop up crypto assets through a potential national stockpile.
Oh, this domestic political push for crypto is a real factor, potentially shaping U.S. policy quite significantly. But does the author believe it fundamentally threatens the dollar's global dominance?
The conclusion in Chapter 19 seems quite clear on this point. The author argues that even if Trump's pro-crypto policies were enacted, they are unlikely to affect the dollar's dominance on the world stage.
Why not?
Because the fundamental reasons for the dollar's supremacy, the U.S. rule of law, the depth and liquidity of U.S. financial markets, the strength and independence of the Federal Reserve, ingrained trust built over decades, and powerful network effects, all those things would remain largely unaffected by these specific domestic policy shifts towards crypto.
It's not like the U.S. is trying to force the dollar on anyone or actively suppress rival currencies, is it?
That's a key part of the argument. The source points out that historically, the U.S. hasn't tried to suppress the international use of the yen or the euro. In fact, it sometimes encouraged it. The dollar's use globally is largely voluntary, driven by the stability, liquidity, and trust the system provides. Trump's occasional threats of tariffs against countries trading outside the dollar are seen in the book as exceptions that prove the rule, and likely bluster.
So, despite all the political noise, the emergence of digital assets, and the persistent calls for de-dollarization, the source concludes that the deep structural advantages underpinning the dollar's dominance remain pretty resilient.
That definitely seems to be the author's central argument, weighing all these challenges against the enduring strengths of the U.S. financial system and the powerful network effects built up over, centuries now.
Well, that was a really comprehensive look at the past, present, and potential future of the U.S. dollar, guided by Paul Blustein's work in King Dollar. Let's quickly recap the key takeaways from this deep dive for you.
Sure. We started way back, looking at the historical roots, seeing how that chaotic manual payment system of 19th century New York, with porters carrying gold, led eventually to the development of modern electronic clearing infrastructure like GPS.
Right.
And we learned that this plumbing, crucially located in the U.S., provides significant leverage and forms the basis of the dollar's global reach and its power as a sanctions tool.
We explored how historical crises, like that 1866 panic in London, established the crucial principle of the central bank as a lender of last resort, a role the Fed played globally during the 2007-2009 crisis. We also discussed concepts like the Triffin Dilemma and exorbitant privilege that have defined the dollar's unique international position and the imbalances it can sometimes create.
And despite frequent predictions of its downfall, the Mark Twain chapter, the dollar has shown remarkable resilience. It's weathered crises and defied doomsayers, bolstered by decisive policy actions like Paul Volcker's tough fight against inflation in the early 1980s, which rebuilt credibility.
That resilience has allowed the U.S. to develop and wield the dollar as a potent sanctions weapon, building on anti-money laundering efforts and leveraging control over global dollar flows. However, we saw the clear limitations. The risk of collateral damage, like the Rusal case, The political backlash and resulting de-dollarization efforts, voiced by leaders like Lula and Ruto, the inherent difficulty in sanctioning large, complex economies like Russia, and the risk of retaliation or overcompliance.
And then we delved into the really disruptive potential of monetary digitization, from efficient, fast payment systems like India's UPI and Brazil's Pix, to the ongoing debate surrounding decentralized crypto, stablecoins, and central bank digital currencies. We saw how ambitious private ventures like Facebook's Libredium ultimately failed to get the necessary regulatory approval to launch at scale.
Finally, we examined the complex debate around CBDCs, balancing potential innovation and stability gains against serious concerns about privacy and government control. We discussed the BIS's evolving perspective, especially their focus on tokenized deposits as a possible path forward, and the author's view that China's ECNY is primarily domestically focused and unlikely to dethrone the dollar globally anytime soon.
We also looked at the influence of domestic politics, including the significant lobbying efforts and spending of the crypto industry, and how figures like Donald Trump have adopted pro-crypto stances. While this raises serious concerns about potential financial instability and conflicts of interest, the source ultimately argues that it's unlikely to undermine the dollar's fundamental global dominance, which rests on much deeper structural strengths like rule of law and trusted institutions.
It's really a fascinating story of how infrastructure, institutions, trust, and political will all converge to create and maintain a global monetary order.
And one that is constantly being tested, isn't it? Tested by new technology and by shifting geopolitical landscapes.
Absolutely. So as we look ahead to a future where digital money in various forms, whether it's CBDCs, stablecoins, tokenized deposits, or something else is likely to become more prevalent, the tension highlighted in the source material really remains front and center. Can the need for the stability, trust, and regulatory oversight traditionally provided by central banks and established financial systems truly coexist with the desire for privacy, autonomy, and disintermediation championed by elements within the digital asset world?
And what does that fundamental tension mean for the dollar's place in the world going forward?
Exactly. Something definitely worth considering.